Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. I always thought Claire and I had the perfect life. Our friends joked about how lucky we were, how compatible we seemed. They'd say we were goals, but they didn't see the cracks that were slowly spreading, the ones that had started almost imperceptibly but grew wider with each passing year. I kept telling myself it was normal. All marriages have rough patches, I thought. And Claire was a busy woman, she'd built her career from the ground up, so I brushed off the long nights and business trips as part of her dedication. It wasn't until that moment, sitting alone in the car on a rainy day in North Carolina, that the truth began to claw its way into my mind. We were supposed to be enjoying a quiet getaway, a chance to reconnect in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Claire had been the one to suggest the trip, which I'd taken as a good sign. Maybe she wanted to try, to bridge the growing silence between us. I'd hoped the fresh mountain air, the time away from work, would bring us back together. But even on vacation, her phone was practically glued to her hand. She kept slipping away to check emails or take calls from her team. I'd resigned myself to it, old habits die hard, I thought. But then, she left her phone on the passenger seat when she went into the store, and that was when I noticed it. Her phone lit up, revealing a text notification from someone named Nick. The message was innocent enough, just a reminder to have a great time and can't wait to see you. But there was something about it, something about the way she'd been so quick to grab her phone and bolt out of the store, that didn't sit right with me. For years, I had ignored my gut, chosen to trust her without question. But suddenly, all the little things that hadn't made sense over the past months, maybe even years, clicked into place. Claire came back to the car with her usual bright smile and a steaming cup of coffee, but my mind was already racing. I wanted to ask her then and there, demand to know who Nick was, what they'd been talking about, why she'd been so secretive. But I held back, deciding not to ruin the trip. Instead, I filed it away, hoping that once we returned home, I'd have a chance to confront her calmly and rationally, without the risk of an explosive scene in a Wawa parking lot. Over the next few days, I kept watching her, noticing the subtle signs I'd been too blind or too trusting to see before. She'd be on her phone late at night, turning the screen away from me as she tapped out messages. When I made a sarcastic comment about her being married to her phone, she'd just laugh it off, saying she was doing work surveys or catching up with friends. It all sounded plausible enough, but the tiny seeds of doubt had already been planted, and they were growing fast. One evening, while she was in the shower, I took the chance to look at our recent phone bills. I'd never felt the need to check up on her before, but something inside me demanded answers. Sure enough, there were calls to a Virginia number I didn't recognize, calls that spanned hours, stretching into the late night and early morning. I ran the number through an online reverse search and saw it was registered as a VoIP number, one that didn't tie to any physical address. That only deepened my suspicion. Why would she need to hide her conversations if she had nothing to hide? But I still wasn't ready to confront her. I told myself I needed more proof, something irrefutable, something she couldn't explain away with a quick excuse. So, I started digging deeper, checking her social media, going through any scraps of information I could find. I found traces of a life I didn't recognize, one filled with small gaps and mysterious moments she'd never mentioned to me. One evening, she went out for what she claimed was a work dinner. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it. But that night, I sat in our quiet kitchen, waiting, every minute that ticked by feeding the anger and doubt festering inside me. She didn't come home until after midnight, slipping into bed without saying a word. I could smell a faint whiff of cologne that wasn't mine, and I lay there, wide awake, every nerve in my body tense with the unspoken betrayal that I now felt was undeniable. The following day, while she was out again, I took the final step. I went into her closet and found the small black suitcase she used for her so-called business trips. My hands were shaking as I unzipped it, finding it filled with travel-sized toiletries, a neatly folded dress, and, hidden in a side pocket, a pack of hotel room keys from various places she'd supposedly been for work. Orlando, Atlanta, Richmond. Cities she had never mentioned to me, cities she'd apparently been visiting without my knowledge. My chest tightened as I counted the keys, as I realized the extent of her deception. That was when I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had loved her, supported her through everything, and trusted her without question. But now, as I sat in our kitchen, holding a key to a hotel room in Orlando, my love turned into something darker. It was a bitter, aching feeling that I couldn't shake, a sense of betrayal so deep that it was almost physical. I spent the next few days in a fog, trying to come to terms with everything I'd discovered. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, lay all my cards on the table, and demand an explanation. But the other part, the part that wanted control, told me to be patient, to gather more proof before tearing apart everything we'd built over the last 12 years. If I was going to confront her, I needed to be absolutely certain, to make it impossible for her to twist the truth. So, I waited. And watched. The opportunity to dig deeper came a few nights later. Claire had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower, and I couldn't resist. My hands shook slightly as I unlocked it with the code I'd known for years but never thought I'd use this way. I tapped into her messages, scrolling quickly through the usual texts from friends and colleagues, until I found a string of conversations with someone listed as N. The messages were casual, at least at first glance, friendly, almost professional. But as I kept reading, the tone shifted, becoming increasingly flirtatious and intimate. They joked about inside moments I had no idea about, shared late-night musings that bordered on the romantic. There were texts with phrases like, "Can't wait for next time" and "I miss your laugh already." I felt my stomach twist as I read those words. Here it was, the proof, in her own words, that our marriage had become just a cover for something else, a mask she wore while living a life I hadn't been a part of. For the next week, I put on a facade of normalcy, pretending everything was fine while Claire continued her charade. She went about her routine as if nothing was wrong, throwing me smiles that once would have felt warm but now felt cold, hollow. Every glance she stole at her phone, every late night at work, every moment she turned away from me only solidified my resolve. When she mentioned another business trip coming up, this time, a weekend conference in Orlando, I barely held back my contempt. She spoke so casually, packing her bag with an ease that made me feel like an outsider in my own marriage. I asked her casually about the conference, probing for details. She gave me the usual spiel: networking, presentations, team-building exercises. The more she talked, the more I saw through the lies, every word she said now tinged with something ugly, something bitter. The night before she was supposed to leave, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, going over everything in my mind, replaying our entire marriage through this new lens. Every late night, every business trip, every little argument that never seemed to make sense, everything took on a new meaning. I was lying beside a stranger, someone who had been pretending to love me while sharing pieces of herself with someone else. The thought tore at me, kept me wide awake in the darkness. The next morning, I put my plan into action. I decided not to confront her until I had something irrefutable, something she couldn't deny. After she left for her conference, I drove down to a friend's house to pick up a small device I'd borrowed, a GPS tracker. This wasn't just some last-minute impulse. I'd spent days researching, making sure I could track her without her knowing. It felt invasive, wrong even, but I needed the truth. I drove back home and slipped the tracker into her car, carefully placing it under the driver's seat, where it wouldn't be noticed. My heart was racing, and a small part of me hoped that maybe I'd be proven wrong, that she'd go to her conference and that this whole nightmare would end. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I knew I wasn't going to find her at any conference, and that when she left town, she'd be heading straight to him. With the tracker set up, I returned home, spent the day with a forced smile plastered on my face, and waited. I waited for her to be on her way, for her destination to pop up on the screen. Sure enough, as I tracked her car's progress, it became clear that she wasn't heading to any conference center. The location she stopped at was a residential neighborhood, miles away from any hotel or convention hall. I zoomed in on the map, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest as her car icon blinked outside a single-family home. I didn't need to see any more. I had the confirmation I needed, the final piece of proof to bring her world crashing down. But my anger wasn't the impulsive, explosive kind. It was a slow burn, a calculated rage that had been festering for weeks. I wasn't going to confront her there, make a scene that would leave me feeling empty and humiliated. No, I wanted her to face the reality she had so carefully avoided, to see the pain she'd caused and the life she'd so callously torn apart. I wanted her to feel the weight of every lie, every deceitful moment, and understand exactly what she'd done. The next day, while she was still with him, I spent hours gathering everything I could, compiling a folder of evidence that was undeniable. I printed out phone records, copies of her messages with Nick, even screenshots of her location history. I went through every moment she'd stolen from our marriage, every word she'd whispered to him that she should have saved for me. It was painful, agonizing even, but I needed to see it all laid out in front of me. I wanted to understand the full extent of her betrayal. That evening, as she returned from her conference, I was ready. She walked through the door, all smiles, carrying her suitcase like she'd just returned from a productive, fulfilling trip. She threw her arms around me, giving me a kiss as if nothing had changed. I felt a wave of revulsion but managed to keep my composure, keeping my anger buried just beneath the surface. "Hey, I hope you had a great weekend," I said, my voice even, calm. She responded with the usual platitudes, telling me about her fake conference, the presentations she'd supposedly attended, the networking she claimed was so important to her job. Every word was like a blade twisting in my chest, but I stayed silent, letting her dig herself deeper. After she'd unpacked, she came downstairs to find me sitting at the dining room table, the folder of evidence laid out in front of me. She looked at it, puzzled, and then at me, still unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "What's all this?" she asked, laughing nervously. I didn't answer. I just stared at her, letting the silence grow, watching as her smile faded, replaced by a look of dawning horror. "Claire," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, "I know everything." Her face drained of color, her hands clenching as she looked down at the folder, flipping through the pages, the messages, the phone logs, the location data, all the lies she'd woven together laid bare in front of her. She looked up at me, mouth open, searching for words, but I didn't give her a chance to speak. Claire's face turned pale as she looked through the contents of the folder, flipping through the damning evidence I'd collected. Her fingers trembled as she held the pages, and for the first time in what felt like years, she looked completely vulnerable, the facade of confidence and control stripped away. I almost felt sorry for her, watching her crumble under the weight of the truth she had tried so hard to conceal. Almost. "Why?" she stammered, finally tearing her gaze away from the evidence. How did you find all this?" Her voice was small, broken, as if she couldn't believe she'd been caught. She had grown so used to her lies that facing the truth had become unimaginable. But I wasn't going to let her shift the conversation, wasn't going to let her play the victim. "How did I find it?" I echoed, my voice cold. "How could I not? You think I wouldn't notice? You think I'd just keep living in blissful ignorance while you paraded around with him?" I practically spat the last word, unable to keep the disgust out of my tone. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved. Not anymore. Not after everything I'd discovered. She had spent so much time building a web of deceit, so many months, maybe even years, crafting lies and manipulating me to protect her double life. Those tears were just another tool in her arsenal, another way to twist reality to suit her narrative. But it wasn't going to work this time. "Please, just let me explain," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Explain?" I repeated, my own voice rising in disbelief. "What exactly is there to explain, Claire? I've seen everything. The calls, the texts, the trips. You've been lying to me for years. The words tumbled out of me, each syllable laced with bitterness and anger. I could feel all the resentment I'd kept bottled up inside me bubbling to the surface, and for once, I let it flow freely. She slumped into the chair across from me, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed quietly, and for a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of her muffled cries. I wanted to yell, to scream, to throw every accusation I had at her, but watching her break down like this, I felt an odd sense of satisfaction. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, wondering if she'd finally understand the depth of the pain she'd inflicted. And now that it was here, I realized that nothing she could say would make it better. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she lifted her head, her face blotchy and tear-streaked. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she choked out, her voice barely audible. Oh, really? I sneered. How was it supposed to happen, then? Were you planning to come home one day, announce you'd found someone else, and just leave me here to pick up the pieces? Or were you going to keep lying to me forever? She flinched at my words, but I didn't stop. You talk about how it wasn't supposed to happen like this, but you never thought about how any of this would affect me, did you? You didn't care. You only cared about yourself, about having your fun, about sneaking around behind my back while I trusted you, while I believed every lie you told me. Claire opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off with a sharp gesture. Save it. I don't want to hear any excuses. I want the truth, for once. I want to know how long this has been going on, how many times you've looked me in the eyes and lied. She took a shaky breath, wiping at her tears. It started, a year ago, she admitted, her voice trembling. I met Nick at a conference, and we clicked. At first, it was just harmless. We'd talk, share a few laughs. But then it turned into something more. Harmless. I laughed bitterly. Is that what you tell yourself? That it was all just harmless fun? You were sneaking away with him, lying to me, destroying our marriage bit by bit, and you think that's harmless? Her face crumpled, and she dropped her gaze, unable to meet my eyes. I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered. I know that sounds ridiculous now, but I was. I don't know. I was unhappy, and I thought I could compartmentalize. I thought it wouldn't affect us. I let out a humorless laugh, the sound echoing through the room. Compartmentalize? Are you hearing yourself? This isn't some petty mistake, Claire. This is our life, our marriage. You can't just box up the parts you don't like and pretend they don't exist. She bit her lip, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. I know. And I hate myself for it. I hate what I've done to us. But please understand, I never wanted it to come to this. I still love you. I do. Love? The word tasted bitter on my tongue. You think you can destroy everything we've built and just say you love me? Do you even know what that word means anymore? Because to me, love means loyalty. It means honesty. It means putting someone else before yourself. You've shown me none of that. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, filled with all the unspoken words, all the shattered pieces of our life together. I watched her, searching for any sign of remorse that might seem genuine, something that might make me believe she actually regretted what she'd done. But all I saw was fear of the consequences she was about to face, fear of losing the life she'd taken for granted. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman I married, the woman I loved, she wouldn't do this to me. She wouldn't lie to me, betray me like this. So tell me, Claire, who are you? She looked away, her eyes distant, as if searching for an answer that would make everything right. But there was no answer, no justification that could ever erase the damage she'd done. She'd shattered my trust, destroyed the foundation of our marriage, and there was no going back. I know I've lost your trust, she said, her voice broken. But please, please don't give up on us. We can work through this. We can go to counseling, try to rebuild what we've lost. I'll do anything, anything to make it right. The desperation in her voice was almost painful to hear, but I couldn't bring myself to feel pity for her. This was her doing, her choice. She had thrown away everything we had, and now she was facing the consequences. Make it right? I shook my head. You can't make this right, Claire. You can't just erase the lies, the betrayal. You chose this. You chose him over me, over us. And now you want me to just forgive you? Pretend like none of this happened? Her face crumpled, and she reached across the table, her hand trembling. Please, I'll do anything. I'll cut off contact with him. I'll show you how much I love you, how sorry I am. I don't want to lose you. I looked at her hand, hovering inches from mine, and felt a pang of sadness, a flicker of the love I'd once felt for her. But it was smothered by the overwhelming weight of betrayal, the realization that this was the end. There was no going back, no way to rebuild what had been broken. You already lost me, Claire, I said quietly, pulling my hand back. The moment you chose him, the moment you lied to me, you lost me. I can't be with someone I can't trust. I won't live in a marriage built on lies. Her face crumpled, and she let out a choked sob, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I felt a strange sense of calm, a clarity that had eluded me for so long. I'd spent so much time trying to ignore the signs, trying to hold on to the illusion of happiness, but now, finally, I was free. Standing up, I gathered the folder and turned to leave. I paused at the doorway, looking back at the woman I had once loved, the woman who had become a stranger. I'll be filing for divorce, I said, my voice steady. You'll hear from my lawyer soon. And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing alone, knowing that this was the end of everything we had once shared. In the weeks that followed, my life unraveled faster than I could have ever anticipated. After leaving Claire that night, I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. The emptiness was strange, almost soothing, but it didn't take long for the solitude to turn into something else, something heavier. At first, I convinced myself I was fine, that this newfound freedom was exactly what I needed. I was finally free from her lies, from the betrayal that had been festering under the surface for so long. But there was another feeling creeping in, one I hadn't expected, grief. I couldn't shake the memories of our years together, the laughter, the quiet moments, the countless dreams we'd shared. I missed her, missed the version of her I'd believed in. The woman who had looked at me with love, who had been my partner, my confidant. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that broken expression as I walked out the door. Part of me hated her for what she'd done, but a part of me, one I couldn't silence, felt hollow without her. One evening, I came home to find a letter tucked under my apartment door. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, but somehow it looked messier, more hurried than usual. I stared at it for a long time before finally tearing it open, the familiar scent of her perfume filling the room. The letter was short, painfully so, and every word felt like a punch to the gut. Dear William. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. I don't expect you to forgive me, I wouldn't forgive me either. But there's something you should know, something I haven't been able to tell you. When you left, I thought I'd be okay. I thought I'd find a way to move on. But I can't. I miss you every day, every minute, and I know it's my fault that I've lost you. There's no easy way to say this, so I'll just say it, I was wrong. I was wrong to think I could compartmentalize, to think that I could live two lives without it tearing us apart. I thought I was doing it for me, but I see now that I was just destroying us. I should have chosen you, William. I should have fought for you. I'll be at the cafe where we first met tomorrow night at 7. I know it's selfish of me to ask, but please, if there's any part of you that remembers the good in us, meet me there. Let me try to say goodbye properly. I understand if you don't come. Just know I'm sorry. Love always. Claire. My hands were shaking as I read her words, the weight of her apology pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to tear the letter up, to throw it away and bury the pain, but another part, the part that still longed for her, that hadn't fully let go, told me to go. It whispered that maybe there was something left to salvage, even if it was just a sliver of closure. I arrived at the cafe early, my mind racing with questions, memories, fragments of the life we'd shared. The place hadn't changed much since that first night. It was still the same small, cozy spot, filled with the familiar smell of coffee and the faint hum of conversation. I found a table in the corner and waited, watching the door with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in weeks. 7 o'clock came and went, but Claire didn't appear. By 7:30, I started to feel the sting of disappointment, a creeping suspicion that maybe this was her way of getting back at me, another layer of punishment for leaving her. But then, at 7:40, she walked in. She looked different, thinner, her face pale and drawn. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she seemed almost fragile, a shell of the vibrant woman I once knew. She saw me immediately and gave a small, hesitant smile, crossing the room to sit across from me. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find the right words. Now that I was here, sitting across from her, the anger I'd held onto for so long felt less sharp, softened by the sadness in her eyes. "I didn't know if you'd show up," she continued, her fingers nervously twisting a napkin in her hands. I wasn't sure if you'd ever want to see me again." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. "But I couldn't ignore your letter. I needed to hear what you had to say." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the table. For a long moment, she was silent, as if gathering the courage to speak. Finally, she looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, William. I know I destroyed everything we had, everything we were. I don't expect you to understand why I did it, because even I don't fully understand. I was lost, confused. And now, I realize I was only hurting the person I loved most." I took a deep breath, her words cutting into me. "Why, Claire? Why couldn't you just talk to me? We could have worked through it together." She looked away, wiping at her eyes. "I wish I had. But I was too scared. I was afraid of losing you, and in the end, that's exactly what I did." She paused, her voice barely a whisper. "I wish I could take it all back." The sadness in her voice was almost unbearable, and for the first time, I felt my own anger give way to a strange, hollow ache. "I wish you could, too," I said softly. Silence fell between us, heavy and final, as if there were no more words left to say. I thought about all the plans we'd made, the life we were supposed to have, and felt the weight of those lost dreams settle on me. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the regret etched into every line on her face. "I'm moving out of the city," she said finally, breaking the silence. "I need a fresh start, away from here, away from everything." I nodded, understanding. There was nothing left for her here, just as there was nothing left for me. It was the end, and we both knew it. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it on top of mine. "Goodbye, William. I'm so sorry for everything." I squeezed her hand, the gesture feeling both final and strangely comforting. "Goodbye, Claire. I hope you find what you're looking for." With that, she stood up, hesitating for a moment as if she wanted to say something more. But then she turned and walked away, disappearing out the door and into the night, leaving me alone in the empty cafe. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me, feeling the weight of the final goodbye settle over me. It was over. She was gone. As I drove home that night, the city lights blurring past me, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with an emptiness I couldn't quite shake. She was out of my life, but the scars she'd left remained, invisible yet permanent. A few days later, I received a call from a mutual friend. The voice on the other end was heavy, serious, and I knew instantly that something was wrong. "I thought you should know," he said, his voice breaking. "Claire, she's gone. She took her own life." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't think. My mind raced back to our last conversation, to the sadness in her eyes, to the final goodbye. I realized, too late, that her pain had run deeper than I'd known. She'd been holding on by a thread, hoping for redemption, forgiveness, something to ease the weight of her guilt. And when I'd walked away, that thread had snapped. A wave of guilt washed over me, crushing, suffocating, as I replayed every moment of our last encounter. I had wanted her to hurt, to understand the depth of my own pain. But I had never wanted this. I had never wanted her to be gone. In the end, all that was left was silence, a silence that would haunt me, a silence filled with words left unsaid, love left unspoken, and the ache of a final goodbye that came too late.